Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Conserving Namibia's Desert Wildlife, presented by Brad Josephs. Brad is our staff naturalist interpreter, and he's been guiding for NatHab since 2005. Today, he's joining us from his home in Arkansas. Thanks for being with us today, Brad. I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kendall. How's it going, guys? Looks like we got almost 400 people already. That's awesome. Hope everybody's enjoying the summer so far and staying healthy and has good opportunities to let us do some teaching online. So I really appreciate the support. It means it's really kind of gotten me through this whole thing, is having something like this to do as I wait for the world to open up again so that we can travel. I'm not a super expert on Namibia, but I do have a lot of experience down there. It was one of the first places that I traveled to when I went to Africa. Spent a few months actually on my own, camping and hitchhiking, and I rented some vehicles. And then this last December, I was able to be a photo tour leader with another guide there named Abner Simeon. So we guided this trip together. It was fantastic. Oh gosh, it was an amazing trip. So I really refreshed my knowledge of the country and my appreciation for it. And then after that, I even stayed. My wife and I rented a vehicle and we drove around and explored for another month. So it's a very unique country, and it's a great place to, like some of our other webinars, we've been talking about all these different adaptations of different places, like especially in the Arctic. Well, this is just as fascinating, and it's one of the best places in the world to really kind of explore a desert place. I did a similar webinar before this daily dose started in mid-March, and that was more focused on the trip itself for people who are interested in it. So this is going to be maybe a little bit shorter because I'm not discussing all these trip details, but what I'm going to do is just focus on some desert adaptations and then some of the of course conservation issues at the end. So I guess we'll kind of get started. But yeah, look at that picture. We were just in the middle of a sea, a dune sea. It's incredible, on the Skeleton Coast. So if you guys aren't really familiar with Namibia, but it's the driest of all of the sub-Saharan countries in Africa, and it's this guy right down here. It's a huge country, and it's very dry. The whole place is either mostly arid or semi-arid. And the reason for that is, as the jet stream in the southern hemisphere goes this way, so it would go from right to left, it's going to be pulling in a lot of moisture off the southern Indian Ocean. And along that coast there, so you'll see Mozambique, Madagascar. I mean, it's very wet there during the monsoon season. It's a monsoon climate. And I remember years ago, I was in Mozambique during the rainy season, and there was no lack of moisture on that side. And the storms came in from the ocean, and it was like a super fire hose intense thunderstorm that never stopped, day after day after day after day. It was just lightning and wind and just pouring rain, just relentless. It was one of the most impressive weather events I've ever seen. So there's plenty of moisture there. However, when all that moisture travels across, there's a sort of high plateau area and a mountain range in this area called the Drakensberg. And there's even the highest point in this kind of central interior of southern Africa is even up to 10,000 feet. But most of this region is 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 feet. And what it does is that air rises, it cools, condenses the moisture out, and it basically wrings all the moisture out. So by the time that hot air comes across the interior of Africa, of southern Africa, and it hits Namibia, there's no moisture left, and there's just nothing there. So it's really one of the driest places on Earth. But there's another interesting thing, is you've got the coast, and you've got this strange thing because you've got this cold currents from Antarctic waters, and it creates what's called the Benguela current. And this situation is very similar to the Humboldt current as it hits the coast of Peru in South America and creates the Atacama Desert, which is arguably the driest place in the world. So this is a very similar sort of ecosystem to that. So here we have more of a map of Namibia. And so the pictures that I'm going to show you and talk about would be in the Namib National Park, which is down in this region, and then up in the Skeleton Coast area of the Kunene region, the Wanab River, and then some of the other wildlife stuff will be in the Etosha region. So you can see Angola's up there. You've got Botswana to your right. Botswana, that's another place that I've been during the rainy season, and there's no shortage of rain in Botswana. However, in Namibia, in the rainy season in Namibia, you will get thunderstorms, and especially up in this corner, up in here, you will get a decent amounts of rain. And so what happens is you'll get these underground rivers. So the really dry areas can survive somewhat just because there's water elsewhere that flows underground. But you can see this little diagram here. All that red is just basically a warm desert. And then the orange is semi-arid because of that rainy season. They do get quite a bit more rain there. And then you actually down at the very bottom left, right here is a cold desert. That's because of this these cold winds that come up from the Antarctica. And the ocean is very, very cold there. Now I say a cold desert, it's not like snow, but it's just it's not characterized as warm. It's very cool on the coast there. It's a cool ocean breezes, temperatures, you know, definitely moderate. As you get into interior Namibia, 120 degrees Fahrenheit is not uncommon in a lot of the times of year. But it's just a beautiful, for desert landscapes, just a beautiful, stunning, stark place. This is a little video that may be a little choppy, but just flying in the air over Namibia, it's staggering because there's virtually no people. You have a huge country, vast country. There's only 2.7 million people. So it's actually rated 193rd densely populated country on Earth. Yes, on Earth, out of 194. The only one that's less densely populated is Mongolia. The most densely populated country is Macau in China, that region. And it there's this island in the south of China, and there's 56,000 people per square mile. You know, Singapore's got about 25,000 people per square mile. Namibia has 8 people per square mile, and Mongolia has 5. There's a couple other countries that rank down there too, but they're not. It's like you know, Greenland, which isn't really its own country. It's kind of part of Denmark, and the Falkland Islands, and things like that. But anyway, the point is that this is one of the most pristine regions in the world because the elements basically are so difficult for everything that it's a hard place for humans to colonize. It's very limited when you have this kind of arid conditions. And then you get these incredibly gorgeous dune seas, some of the highest, like I think this is dune 7. This is the highest, one of the highest dunes in the world at 1,200 something feet tall. And you'll notice this kind of red coloration. It's because it's all this ocean of sand dunes that's over towards the western part of Namibia along the coast. Where it comes from are these winds getting blown across Africa for, I think this desert is 55 million, well, yeah, years. It's one of the oldest deserts in the world. But so you have all these particles that are blowing in from this interior of Africa, and they kind of collect when you get this kind of a complex weather system along the coast, and they basically pile up these, you know, these sand dunes that do move and shift, and they're just fantastically beautiful. So this red color is from iron deposits. As beautiful as it is, it's harsh. Because pretty much everything in the world needs water, and there's no water here. A little further north in the Kunene region, you also have dune seas, but that sand doesn't have the iron deposits, so it's more whitish color. But it's unbelievable. It's like another planet. It's like planet Tatooine, and that Star Wars. You know, it's just ocean of these beautiful sand dunes. But it's not a place that many creatures can live. And if you go all the way to the coast, that's called the Skeleton Coast, and it's kind of interesting. And so this is the coast, this is the ocean here, where all that cold air is coming in from Antarctica. And the reason they call it the Skeleton Coast is this upwelling of water is brilliant for seafood. So it's incredibly rich for fish, but the waves are huge. the winds are high, and there's lots of pinnacles and things and hazards. So there's about 1,000 shipwrecks there, and so they originally called it the Skeleton Coast because of they used to harvest lots of marine mammals that were living there along the coast to make use of this bounty of sort of seafood, shrimp, krill, fish, squids, things like that are just so plentiful. So there's these fishing boats back before GPS, when you just were dead reckoning, you were using charts. There was lots and lots of shipwrecks, and so that's why it's this sort of mysterious place. And it's yeah. So if you ever get a chance to go to the Skeleton Coast, it's fantastic. And these are Cape fur seal skulls that are littered along the shore. Not from there's very little. I can't remember. I don't think there's no harvest of these marine mammals anymore. But so they're very plentiful. So that's why there still are lots of bones and skeletons of marine mammals, just natural occurring deaths. And this, I mean, some of the names for it's like the gates of hell. And if you go there, I mean, it's not an unpleasant place to be as long as you have the right supplies. It's a very remote, but you can see that there's some of the sand is filled with garnet sand, so it's kind of red. It almost looks like blood. But it's a very ethereal place with cold breezes that come in, and the remnants of all these commercial fishing vessels that risked it all to try to catch all these great fish. Huge breakers coming in, and there are colonies of several colonies where there's over 100,000 of these Cape fur seals, like several of these colonies, and they're loving life there. But it's so strange is that the reason they call the gates of hell is if you shipwreck here, you crash and you get off onto the beach, there's no water, you're done. I mean, you're just temperature's fairly pleasant. It's cool ocean breeze, but there's just no water at all. So it's a really kind of a stark juxtaposition of this wonderfully productive world of water versus this shore, but none of that water is fresh water. It's all salt water. So unless you're a marine mammal that can deal in a saltwater place and don't have to drink water because you're getting it all from your food, it is hell. So as these winds come in from the Benguela Current, and they do have moisture on those winds, they collide with the hot African winds that are coming out of the interior that are bone dry. So the only moisture available a lot of times is just in the form of fog. So if you drive inland from the Skeleton Coast a little bit, you will see some plants, and you may not have had rain in several years. And what rain might fall is going to get evaporated in that hot sand, and immediately just, how fast water goes through sand. I mean, it's not going to sit around and wait for the roots to develop and stuff like that. So I mean, these plants actually can't survive or rely on any kind of rain shower events or rainy seasons or anything like that. But there are plants there. That's what's so fascinating about it. Probably the most famous one is the Welwitschia plant. This is a botany professor from Missouri, Dr. Pyre, that came on our trip, and his major thing is he really wanted to see a Welwitschia plant in the wild, and they're very hard to find and they're rare, but along certain places on the Skeleton Coast you will find these things. So these plants can live thousands of years, but how do they do it when there's no water? And the one interesting thing about this plant is all that structure that you see, it's only 2 leaves that just keep growing out. So it's a 2-leaf plant. But as far as the interesting thing about what it can do is it can survive because you get this coastal fog very often. And even though it doesn't rain, there's a lot of surface area on these plants, and the leaves are structured such that they have a lot of surface area, so you get a lot of condensation, and then the water that condenses during these fog events will flow down into this deep taproot. So that's one way that this plant can survive these tremendous harsh conditions. But other plants as well. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about these desert adaptations. So as we know, plants basically use photosynthesis as a process where you take light, water, and carbon dioxide, and you make energy, sugar, and oxygen. Well, what happens to a plant when you take one of those away? What if there's no water available, or very, very limited amount of water? How does this happen? And so this is an interesting process for these, what we call xeric adaptations. Xeric is like basically desert adapted. That's a fancy word for it. So xeric adapted plants. One of the cool aspects they have is that along the cell wall of the plant, which is basically the solar collecting panel, and it's very complicated. We talk about, I'm sure you guys remember in biology, this was many lectures of. We'll just kind of keep it simple and just show you this one interesting aspect. Well, the cell wall of the plant, it needs to have pores of air. So as it's pulling water from the root system to get it up into the leaves so it can do the photosynthesis in the leaves, that water needs to evaporate out of pores. So it will use that sort of hydrostatic pressure to pull the water from the ground to the leaves. That's how the leaves get there. It also needs to take in CO2 and also get rid of oxygen. So it needs these pores that open up. They're called stomatas. So plants have these pores that are opened up. Now, the xeric adapted, they use something called cam photosynthesis, where they will close those stomatas during the daytime and only open them at night. So they do their breathing at nighttime, but you're going to lose much less water if you do it at night when it's much cooler than if you had left those pores open during the daytime. So that's a very important desert adaptation for plants. Then you've got other interesting adaptations, like this is the baobab tree, which is very famous, and they can live almost to 2,000 years, and places where they virtually no rain at all. They do this with a super deep root system, but you'll notice, why is that trunk shaped so strangely? It is like a sponge, and it just absorbs water and stores it. So it's just like a barrel of water with some leaves coming out. So that's a really fantastic plant. Oh yeah, I'm gonna just wanted to, let's see. There is, oh yeah, there's something called the shepherd's tree. I forgot the name of it. In the Kalahari Desert, and it's going to be using these really deep root systems as well. And their roots there can get to be 230 feet deep. So able to utilize places where there's no groundwater at all. I'm sorry, there's no surface water at all, just all groundwater flowing from somewhere else, maybe all the way up in Angola, and it floats all the way down underground, inaccessible to everything. But some of these trees in these desert places in Africa can have very deep roots. Now this is the Namib beetle. This one's pretty amazing, and we saw this guy in the Namib Knockoft Desert around Sossusvlei. Very famous, and I'm so glad we did finally find one. But it's a beetle that lives in the sand, basically zero water. But you'll notice you've got these pores or these bumps. What that is it's more surface area. And that surface area collects the moisture. So just from the fog, all you're getting is fog. So as that wind blows, it hits, and it's going to be condensing on the beetle, and more surface area is going to be the more condensation. And then there's grooves. So when it fills up with water during these foggy times, it gets its drink. So it basically stands on its front legs, does a little handstand, and then the water basically flows down into its mouth. So beetles drink the water droplets. So that's something that can survive strictly on fog. So those are some of the adaptations of using what Namibia has, is this basically a fog machine to allow things to survive. But the other thing I'll talk about now is these underground rivers called ephemeral rivers. Now this is an interesting one. This used to be a marsh, but maybe 700 or 800 years ago, the climate did dry out more, and so there was an underground river. It was also thought this underground river, and this river that used to flow into this marsh ephemerally during certain times of year, was blocked off by these sand dunes that migrate with the wind. So now it's called dead flay. Flay is the South African word for marsh. So this is a dead marsh, and this is several hundred-year-old camel thorn trees that have been blackened in the sun. And so it's one of the really cool things, but it just shows this presence of these underground rivers. This particular underground and ephemeral water source. Ephemeral meaning it's not available all the time of year. And this is just an oasis in the middle of the Dune Sea. and it's coming from water somewhere else and upwelling as like a spring. And it is just an oasis full of birds, beautiful plants. And so there are exceptions to this place that has no water available. And so a lot of animals will know about this water source, which is always there, and then can do migratory trips when water's incredibly limited at certain times. So this is the Wanab River, and even though they had not had rain, the Namibia just this year ended about like a 7 or 8 year drought. It's one of the most severe droughts, the most severe drought lengthwise, duration-wise that they've ever had. But still, when you go there, you will notice these fantastic plant areas that, again, some of it's been utilized by the fog, but a lot of it's just they're really good at storing up water when it's there. And these ephemeral rivers, and these rivers will at certain times of year have water if they get enough rain inland in that area that was semi-arid. That water will eventually flow down. So you do have these corridors where there's nice plants. So I'm going to talk about this gal named MC. She's a biologist that works in the skeleton coast on brown hyenas. And she took this picture this year. When we were there, super struggling with the drought, and it just was, everything was starting to die. Plants were starting to go away. Animals getting thin. But that first one of our nights there, we had our first rain of that rainy season. You could see it was lightning, and we didn't get much, but we got some. And it was kind of like hopefully a foreboding of a good rainy season, and it was a really good rainy season. So it did get lots more rain. Later on this year, around December. And so this is a picture of some oryx, which is the classic desert ungulate in the Wanab River. When we were there, I took that picture, and totally dry, just some sparse plants that are available from the last time a little bit of water was available there the year before. But then about 3 or 4 weeks after I left, she posted this picture of this life-giving water just flowing right into this dry riverbed. So that's pretty amazing. So yeah, so there are ungulates that are incredibly adapted to be able to survive without being able to drink water all the time. And such as the oryx is probably one of the best examples. And as long as there's some kind of plant material, these trees hopefully getting a little bit of groundwater so they can have some leaves, that's enough moisture for these oryx to survive. They don't need to drink, they just need to absorb from the food. It's beautiful. These guys, oryx are gorgeous and so tough. They're really the reputation for being difficult for predators to take down and very dangerous is big. They have these dagger-like horns, which they will kill lions. So yeah, the oryx is one of the coolest animals that we see down there. But you'll even get giraffes, and this is in the middle of the vast desert. And I admire these animals because they are just relying on what leaves are left around. But it's enough to support giraffes and different other animals. How do these animals deal with it? I mean, humans need to drink water every day. Like, how can you just get a little bit of moisture from your leaves and be able to survive? And it's this is a anatomy and physiology of animals lesson that would be very, very complicated. And I have a hard time remembering exactly, and it's very, very complicated. But this is one of the adaptations, the xeric adaptations these animals have are specialized kidneys. So, when a human's dehydrated, your urine is really, really sort of bright colored. It's very concentrated. And what that tells you is, oh, I'm not drinking enough water. I need to drink more water so that I have clear urine. So that's healthy. And humans always have water around, so it's not a big deal. But if you're a xeric adapted animal, you don't want to waste any water at all. So that's how their urine always is. And it's just about special structures. And you can read papers and pages of really complicated stuff. But these structures in these xeric adapted animals are different than, say, humans, which are not really desert adapted. So their kidneys are specialized to concentrate. So what a kidney is basically a filter that takes out the toxic substances, excess salts, excess minerals, and uses the liquid in urine as a way to get rid of it. And so what these specialized desert kidneys do is they just make sure that as little water is lost as possible. The other way, this is countercurrent heat exchange, and that's something that is used for animals that are trying to absorb, keep heat in a cold climate, like polar bears, all those cold weather animals. They're trying to basically keep their breathing in through their nasal turbinates, which are the nose bones. And that's a way to heat that air before it gets in to the core, and then also collect it again before it goes out. So just in this, the more countercurrent heat exchange that's being utilized for trying to hold in warm air in a cold climate, but also can be used for reabsorbing moisture and trying not to lose so much moisture. Those nasal turbinates, those passageways in the nose are going to be more complex. And this is kind of a cool little graph here. And I forgot I can't see on there because I got this panel here. But this basically shows the temperature of the exhaled air at certain temperatures. So basically, humans are up here. They basically always breathe out this warm air. But what I want to show you is that 8 is a kangaroo rat. They don't live in Namibia, but they're similar species. But this is just showing you that, like, the domestic duck is not a desert adapted creature, but a kangaroo rat for sure is. So it has special nasal turbinates. So basically, the air it's breathing out is cooler than the other animals. And kind of these little graphs down here, or these little diagrams, basically it shows the cold, dry air, or just in a lot of this, yeah, this very dry air comes in to the nose, and there is moisture in it, and so it's basically hitting the nasal mucosa and evaporating, and they're being able to absorb that moisture. I'm sorry, no, the other way around. It's getting moisture from the nasal mucosa, so that the air that comes into the core is now warmed and also humid. And then when it's exhaling, it does the opposite. This warm, humid air is beginning to cool, and you have more nasal mucosa to reabsorb that moisture. So, and that's a little bit complicated, but that's something that's very, very important for regulating heat loss, and also trying to get moisture out of this warm, humid air that's coming out of your core. Hope I explained that the right way. And so, what comes in, what goes out. You're trying to get as much water as you can in for your food or drinking, but then you want the least amount to exit. And so this is why these are the scat of an oryx we talked about. And just notice how small they are. They're like little tiny pebbles. And so you basically have your large intestine is also going to be specialized to squeeze as much moisture. There's lots of surface. There's much more surface area for the volume of poop if you have these little tiny pellets where you can squeeze and reabsorb so much more of that moisture than if it was just a big pile. Now up here is just a way that I like to explain it. This is moose poop. Moose are in Namibia, but this is really interesting. This is a summertime moose scat. Most people only think of moose scat as the little pellets like you see on the left. But the thing is that they only poop like that in wintertime. And why is because they're eating browsy vegetation like woody stuff. There's no water, very little water in that vegetation, and you're in a super cold place. There's not like running water available very often. So they are, during that time of year, they basically poop out little pellets so they can reabsorb most of that moisture. In the summertime, they're hanging out in swamps, or they're eating leaves that are green and lush, and they don't care about moisture content. There's unlimited amount. So that's why the poop looks like this in the summer versus this in the wintertime. And that's why the oryx desert animals, their poop looks like this. And every animal that lives in the desert has a similar type of little poop. Like kangaroo rats are tiny. So all these animals are trying to reabsorb. So that's a way for them not to be losing too much excess water. So you have ways. The plants are there, and struggling with their ways. So you have things for the herbivores to eat. And so then you can also have predators. So these are desert lions of Namibia. So they don't, not that anatomically different from the rest of the lions, but they live in the driest place of any lions. And a lot of it's just with behavior. But they've actually followed these lions around and seen them not drink any water from a water hole or anything for like several weeks at a time. So they can deal with it in certain ways. And they just, if I was going to come back my next life as a lion, it would be a lion in a different place. But these guys are beautiful, and you got to admire them so much. Living in a super harsh climate. Now, a lot of it is behavioral adaptations. It's why they pick a nice, cool spot to rest during the day, limit their activity during the hot, dry part of the day. And then you'll only see them active in the early morning, late evening, and then they'll be active at night as well hunting. So that's a behavioral adaptation. But they pretty much, these lions will get all of their water from their food. So there is water in the oryx that it has gotten from vegetation, and because it's got countercurrent nasal passages, it's great kidney, it poops out little poops, it conserves that water enough, and so the lion actually is not only just getting food, it's getting enough water by eating this meat. It's a female lion eating this oryx. So yeah, so I wanted to, as far as conservation, so there's the desert adaptations that I wanted to cover, and then so as far as the lions go, this is a conservation aspect. There's an incredible conservation lion biologist named Dr. Philip Stander, who's dedicated his entire life to this very dwindling population of very, very special lions. And the reason why they already live a harsh life as it is. It's not easy for them to live along the skeleton coast in this desert, but the other things that live in certain areas are humans that are bringing their cattle down to graze on the vegetation in these ephemeral rivers as well. So cattle, sheep, different kinds of livestock like that. Well, they conflict with the lions. So they've had tremendous retribution killing problems. And so this Dr. Philip Stander has dedicated his life to being the hero. So he's always tracking the lions, knows about them, publishing papers about how they're surviving, getting the word out, and also trying to mitigate some of this damage and look for solutions so that these lions are not illegally killed. So he's an amazing conservationist. There's a few other predators here. This is one that actually was in a little pool of water. It was a spring. It was bathing in a spring along the skeleton coast. This is an extremely critically endangered brown hyena. So it's very different from the spotted hyena that most people think of when they think of African hyenas. And there's a pied crow there as well. And as far as conservation goes, there's a gal named MC Verwey, and she's basically a research director at Wilderness Safaris. And I'm going to talk more about it, but you have these areas that a lot of these areas in Namibia, luckily, are not open to livestock grazing. They've been allocated as concessions, conservation concessions. So somebody like Wilderness Safaris, who's a Natural Habitat's partner in Africa, will own that, run it, and then basically fund their own protection, research, everything else. So this is a very special animal, this brown hyena, and because of, well, when you get places with livestock, when the herders and the ranchers lose livestock, what a lot of times what they do is they just put poison on the carcass and leave, and then whatever animal killed it, be it lions, will go. And a lot of these brown hyenas they've basically been eradicated through this poisoning. Even though the brown hyena basically never actually kills the animal, but they've suffered a ton. And it's not as charismatic as a lion. Most people kind of think of hyenas as kind of an evil, sort of dirty animal that eats dead things, and not really the most popular. But I personally love all the hyenas. They're incredible. But this brown hyena is one that definitely doesn't get the charismatic support. So MC, who used to be a camp director at one of the remote camps on the Skeleton Coast that we go to on our NatHab trips, she began taking this interest in these brown hyenas. And this isn't her pet. It's just one that she's so patiently watched and observed in this protected area that they got used to her. And so she was able to gather tons and tons of information that they didn't know much about these brown hyenas. So she's another conservation hero. And there actually are elephants in this desert. These are desert adapted elephants. When you think about elephants, like if you have an elephant in captivity, it will drink 50 gallons of water per day, plus eat all the stuff it's eating, which is tons. How in the heck can elephants live in a place where there's no water at all for months or even years at a time? But they're there, again, getting almost all their moisture out of their vegetation that they eat. And acacia thorns is their favorite food. And I will tell you, it is painful to watch these elephants feed, because they're eating thorns that I grabbed onto some of these branches and thorns and felt how hard they were. And I mean, they'll cut your hands if you squeeze them too hard. They're super hard, super sharp. The last thing that you would ever want to be eating. That's basically all these guys eat. They just grab it with their super tough trunk and skin and crush them up, and you'd expect their mouth to be covered in holes, but they survive it. They do it somehow, and that's where they're also getting their water. So these desert adapted elephants is something that I'm not going to talk about too much now, because I would really like, well, there's the number. So this group of elephants used to be, massive, used to be much larger. And they could migrate if there wasn't enough food. They could migrate up into the northern part of Namibia, and they used to do that. But now with a land conversion, they can't. They've kind of lost their migratory habits, and they're stuck down in these ephemeral river systems like the Wanab River on the Skeleton Coast. And like as far as even 1975. So what happened in Namibia was there was a war of independence. So originally it was a German colony around the turn of this for a long time, and then around the turn of the century. And then after the World Wars, Germany lost that land to South Africa, and there was a lot of independence struggles. And so they finally had this huge war, this war of independence. And it didn't even, Namibia wasn't even an independent country until 1990. But during this wartime period is the worst time to be an animal. And so there were reports of the South African army just going on patrols and just shooting elephants, entire herds from helicopters, just so they could load up their ivory and take it home as trophies. So there was a vast loss of elephants. And then since then, because of the habitat conversion and loss, different problems that are happening, you already have a harsh place to begin with, and very difficult for these elephants to survive. And there's just a few hanging on. And a lot of times they will go out of these protected concession areas into a rural village and then just wreak havoc and do tons of damage. And then when that happens, the villagers will kill them and eat them. So it's really been a struggle. So when you're out in the desert area like this and you see these elephants, you really will fall in love with them. You admire them so much, and you want them around. So luckily, there are some incredible conservation heroes that have dedicated their life to also follow, just like Dr. Standard does with the lions. These guys do it with the elephants. They follow them. They basically keep track of all the numbers, and they publish scientific journals about them. They get the word out, and they put basically these, just like MC does with the brown hyenas, get people to appreciate these elephants. And then they help support the tourism as well. And incredible conservation heroes, Dr. Brown and Dr. Ramey. They live in Nederland, Colorado, but they spend half their year tracking these elephants and protecting them and learning about them and studying them and advocating for them. And I'm really hoping that we can get these guys to do a webinar with me, specifically talking more about this project. So if you hear that webinar scheduled, you don't want to miss it. And there, where MC, the brown hyena researcher, and the elephant researchers that I just mentioned, their base camp is this Wanab River camp, which is run, for tourism. That's where we stayed. So this infrastructure that's brought in and funded through the tourism allows the elephant conservation and the brown hyena conservation to happen. And the fact that it is a big, huge area that's protected because you have the money coming in for the tourism. So yeah, the animals are there, people will come, people will love it. The money is given to increase the protection, and it's great for the economy, it employs the locals, and it gives a place in a very remote area where these guys can also do their research and conservation efforts. This is the Skeleton Coast Camp of Wanab River, one of the coolest places I've ever been. And you just are employing these guides. Like this is my buddy Abner that I guided with, and just that's really where most of the conservation in Africa, the best successes really are through conservation. I'm sorry, through tourism. Is you're employing the locals, you're putting a value on that. So even the government that are trying to develop the country for different uses, they will always look at having those animals and those ecosystems alive, because it is a direct economic benefit, and Africa is incredibly important. And it does fund little things. So if you have the money coming in to support these concessions, then you have money for there to be, people can put up solar water pumps. So there's about 100,000 boreholes in Namibia. So Namibia doesn't have enough water for anybody, for any creatures almost. I mean, but it does have lots of groundwater. And so if you have, so these safari camps, they will have these water holes. And a lot of these animals will benefit and survive in these marginal habitat areas because of the help of the water holes. So these are the lions of Ungava. And the Ungava lions are, it's just another really, really amazing example of this awesome concession area that's run directly through tourism dollars that allows this awesome sanctuary of these lions. I mean, 100 years ago, there was estimated to be 200,000 lions in Africa. Now there's only 20,000. So tons and tons of habitat loss, conflicting with livestock herders, and now poaching. So these little concession areas that people go to see these animals, that supports these guys. What lions are really having a bad problem now, because, and I'm gonna have to talk about this, is the Asian traditional medicine market. That's the hugest enemy right now for everything, for so many species in the world. Tiger bone is supposed to be an aphrodisiac, although it's not. But the reason is because if you ever look at a big cat mating, cats can hunt like over a 3-day period, can mate for several hundred times. Now each mating event only takes a few minutes, or actually just 10 seconds. But they'll do it over and over and over and over. So if you're looking at that animal, you say, wow, that's a lot of endurance for the male. Maybe the bones will help me be the same way. And it doesn't happen like that. And tiger is really the sort of the famous example of an animal that suffers from this. But because tigers are so difficult to get now, very well protected in India, and there's not very many of them left. Some of these medicine dealers are beginning to utilize easier things to get, such as lions. So you just got to love the fact that you have these concession areas that are run through tourism, because you have a water hole for them. It's protected, and it's not only protected by the government laws to protect it. The money that comes from tourism will fund these concession areas to have their own private anti-poaching units and security systems, remote cameras, drones, fully military rangers that actually are better funded than the anti-poaching units in sort of the national parks or the government-run areas. So this is just a lion that I just wanted to show you. This was mating season. He was gonna, where that female was an estrus, and that's a process known as flamen, where a lot of times you'll see these pictures of tigers or lions with this kind of roar, and all it's really doing is it's sniffing her and smelling kind of her hormones, and it passes that air back through the nose again. I'm sorry, from the nose through the mouth, and it goes over what's called the vomeronasal organ, which is really well developed in some animals like cats, and they can pick up a lot more information based on kind of, you know, what her receptivity is and what her mating status is. These, like this Ungava concession that's right on the outskirts of Etosha National Park, is one of the greatest strongholds of the rhinos. Rhinos, they believe that every 8 hours a rhino is killed for its horn. Rhino horn is another thing. So a rhino can mate for 1 hour. It does take, so they will mate, they will copulate for an hour. So again, if you're looking at that, you'll say, wow, that's a lot of endurance. Maybe if I grind the horn up and drink it, it will help me. Again, it's just keratin. The horn is just like a fingernail. Absolutely zero medicinal value whatsoever. But the old tradition says it is. So yeah, you're going to get every 8 hours a rhino is killed for its horns, and the horn can go for $26,000 a pound. So that's why it's so big, and it's almost an unstoppable force. And these are funds from the elephant's killed every 15 minutes for its ivory. And this money is going to fund terrorist organizations and crime rings. So, and it's almost unstoppable. I mean, these guys can fly in with helicopters and into these developing countries that don't have the capacity to wage this war over these big frontier areas. But a lot of these private concessions, such as Ungava, they can't afford it, and they have anti-poaching units in a system, so it's basically impossible to poach these rhinos. Also, the dollars go towards if there's a really bad drought like this year. Well, these rhinos, a lot of these rhinos might starve. So they have supplemental feeding just to keep the numbers up. That's how critically endangered. Well, the white rhino is not nearly as endangered as the next one I'll talk about, which is the black rhino, which is critically endangered. But the white rhino is called white because its mouth is wide, and that word wide in the Afrikaans language sounded like white, and so it just actually was a misnomer. So it's nothing white about it. It's no wider or blacker than a black rhino. It's just the fact that its mouth is wide, as opposed to these black rhinos, which are also called hook-lipped rhinos. White rhinos graze on grass. Hook-lipped are browsers, so they have these kind of hook-shaped mouth, and they will eat the vegetation. More browse, like bushy type stuff, like you see behind these two rhinos in a water hole, again at Ungava. And they come down for water holes. Now check out this amazing horn. And of all the pictures I've just showed you, and that's a very rare thing. There's almost nowhere in Africa where you can see these rhinos with full horns. Because if you have rhinos that have the full horns, it's $30,000 a pound. It's too tempting that some poachers will find a way to get them. So here's a black rhino, and you'll notice that the horns have been trimmed off, and they will grow back, and these horns are growing back. And so it just makes it less attractive and less incentive for the poachers to poach. However, it's sad because this is right next to Ungava. It's in the Etosha National Park. It's not the private concession with the private concessions anti-poaching units. It's not as well protected. They had hundreds of rhinos poached in the last few years from the national park itself. And a lot of it was actually inside job, just because the lure of the money was just too much. So they will cut these horns off, and the sad part is that the lions of Etosha National Park have learned that without those big horns, the rhinos can't actually defend themselves, and so they're learning how to actually prey on the rhinos. Like you probably see lots of these claw marks. Lions, looks like maybe lions have gone after, or it could just be walking through the scrubby brush. But so here's something, and as you guys, if you've heard me before, you know that I do guide trips in China. I've been guiding in China since 2008, and I love the Chinese culture, and I love Chinese wildlife. But we do have to understand the new age of things is that China is industrializing extremely fast. Nothing will stop them from being even more influential in the world as the United States is. So right now, the United States is, of course, influential. We've run the show across the whole planet. Well, China is going to overtake that. And as they build up these new Silk Road routes, their expansion and influence in the world is huge. So they're also doing tons of stuff in Africa. So you have these countries that are undeveloped. China will go down and invest in the infrastructure. And in return, they can get a deal where, oh, well, now I have this port and I can run things and we can extract all these resources that they want from Africa because they've gone and done the investing. I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars of money is going to developing Africa by the Chinese. And the problem with that is that it's not great for the African economy, really. Actually, all the money pretty much goes back to China. They even bring their own construction crews. So it's not helping the economy any. But the other problem is you have much more Chinese influence. And that is one of the biggest places where the Asian medical or Asian medicine trade goes to. So if you have lots and lots and lots more Chinese in Africa, these poaching rings have been growing a lot. Now, speaking of that, I've got lots more to say about China and conservation. It's not all negative. There's some really positive things happening. And if you go back to one of the first Daily Dose webinars, I did one on China's changing views on nature and conservation. So, and how important that is. So, and it was with my buddy Philip, we did it together and talk about, China has some problems, just like lots of Asian countries have desires for things that are causing major problems. However, it's not the full story, and there are some silver linings to that. So if you want to hear me talk much more about China in the world and maybe the hope for the world, you might want to click on or go to the NatHab YouTube page and find that recording and watch it. And it's very unique information that I put out there. So other places that you can get more information for conservation or help support, of course, is a World Wildlife Fund that does tons of work all over the world, including for sure rhinos, elephants, helping to fight poaching, working with traffic, which is like Interpol for wildlife trade, and just doing dozens and dozens and dozens of different projects to help support things like ecotourism, help make the communities more healthy of people, and help the conflicts go down from these animals and the indigenous people. So World Wildlife Fund, of course, huge powerhouse and very powerful politically as well. You also have some smaller ones that are pretty cool. This one is interesting. I just wanted to put it out there. So VetPaw, they are military veterans, a lot of them from the United States, like special forces guys that are retired. And they're using their skills, their heavy military skills, to go down, train local rangers, anti-poaching units. Actually, they do a lot of their own stuff as well. Like they will fight poachers and stuff. But you got some poorly trained rangers with some rifles trying to stand up against these very special, well-funded poaching units. Now you've got Green Berets there, ex-Green Berets that'll go down and actually do a lot of the fighting with them. So that's pretty neat. I mean, I do admire that a lot. It's pretty fascinating. They help with the surveillance and protection. All these technologies that they've learned by working for the United States military, they're putting to work themselves to help protect African wildlife. I just think it's really neat. So that's something that you guys might want to check out. And also another huge one that does is Wild Aid, and really helping with trying to do all kinds of, a lot of even undercover work to try to uncover these international poaching rings and spread a lot of awareness. So those are Wild Aid, VetPaw, WWF. And if you want to read more, I've written lots of articles about Namibia that's my blog, so alaskabearsandwolves.com. And so, and there's my Instagram page if you want to look at animal pictures as well too. So Brad Joseph's photos. And then here's a little screenshot of something that I thought was fantastic that NatHab has done. Is I was talking about how those agencies that are funded by donors are extremely important for this conservation effort. But as I've just mentioned a whole bunch of times as well, it's the tourism is a huge influence in putting a value on these animals. So these locals are being put to work and a value put on it, and so that encourages conservation. Well, what happens during the COVID COVID-19? What happens during coronavirus? There's no tourists coming. So that, I mean, there's guys that are literally like starving to death. Our local partners around the world, Camp Cruise, things like that. So Nathab Ben Bressler thought of a brilliant idea. And he said, look, these guys are starving, and Nathab is also struggling. There's no money coming in. I mean, it's a dire situation. But instead of what he thought about first was, what about all of these guides and things that are the heart of conservation? What's going to happen to them when there's no tourists coming? So he set up this fund where he said, well, if you give us, for every $250 that you donate, you'll get 250 off a future trip. And then they started it out with, I think, 25,000. Anyway, so it's all the way up to, the last time I looked at it, was well over $250,000 that this money is being allocated out to the local partners to keep these guys alive, so that we don't lose the whole purpose of the ecotourism. Our wildlife tourism is really the key to saving most of the stuff. You can't rely all on these NGOs to do it. You have to get the locals involved and employed to save this wildlife. Okay, Kendall. Wow, 257. So that's these are my last slides. So we can do questions.
Great. We do have some questions for you, and we'll probably go just a little over the hour, since we're getting close to the top of the hour as it is. And before we get to the Q&A, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you do have a question for Brad, you can submit that via the questions field in your control panel. Okay, yep. Brad.
Eventually I'll okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay. What is the population of the lions in Namibia? Is it going up or
down? I think it's definitely going down. I don't have a number of Namibia specifically. I just know, you know, in Africa in general, it's about 20,000, and that includes all of Africa. But yeah, Namibia definitely is a huge stronghold.
Okay.
For the lions.
A lot of, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just saying, I'm going to have to say that the number's dwindling. I mean, there's a couple star areas that are wonderful, such as Etosha, where they're being protected, but the poaching threat is now grave. It's a grave problem.
There were a lot of people who were curious about the lion behavior in Namibia and if they have prides like they do elsewhere in Africa. Yeah,
they do, exactly. It is virtually identical. I mean, they do have it. Yeah, they'd have a pride. You can have, yeah, big alpha male, several females, some subordinate males. So the social structure of the desert lions and the lions all through Namibia, yeah, is the same.
And what's the one thing that's different is
the one thing that is different is like the Kalahari lions have just a really black mane. These guys have a blonde mane. So is one reason why the desert lions in Namibia have had problems with trophy hunting in the past, because you know you get these trophy hunters that want a black mane lion and they want one that's got a blonde. The bird life in Namibia is can be great. Yeah, I've got lots and lots of bird pictures. I didn't just post a bunch. I think it does not as good as, depending on the time of year you go, as say the Okavango Delta, especially during the rainy season. If you really love birds, Okavango in the wet season, it's fantastic. And the great thing about if you guys go down there, you can do Okavango and then also just go do Namibia. So you can have some of these incredible desert safari experiences that are so different from the Okavango Delta. Neither one's better. They're just super different. But yes, there's bird life in Namibia, but it's not nearly as prolific as some of the wetter areas.
Okay, and there were a few questions about the brown hyenas. Some of them were, how do they differ from other hyenas? What's their greatest threat? How big are they? Can you provide some insight?
Yeah, they're a bit smaller than the spotted hyena, and that's one of their biggest threats, is that if there are spotted hyenas around there, they will actively kill brown hyenas. So will lions. Their biggest threat, I think, is mostly just the habitat loss, and then people putting out poison bait to get rid of predators for livestock. And those brown hyenas are going to be ones that'll definitely go to the carcasses and eat it because they're super scavengers. And then so that's a huge loss for those guys. But nowhere, because the places that they live are so harsh, like Kalahari Desert, Skeleton Coast, only the really hard desert places really. You don't really see brown hyenas in like Okavango Delta. They tend to be more of a desert. And so I think the main difference is they don't operate in big packs like the spotted hyenas. Spotted hyenas can have huge packs, families, and are voracious predators. They're very successful predators. Brown hyenas are just much more solitary, and instead of hunting so much, they're just scavenging. And brown hyenas are really beautiful, and they have a very shaggy coat.
Okay. A lot of people are curious about the best time to visit Namibia.
It's hard to say really. With the time that I have gone both times has been right around kind of November, December, right as the rainy season comes on. So you have this green up of all the trees. And it's also, it's very hot. But that was the time that I like to go the most. If you go like in the midsummer, it actually can be fairly cold at night. You can even get down into the 30s in some places. But it's not nearly as hot during the day. It's not as hot during the day. Only at nighttime it's cold. It's not as hot during the day. When we went, yeah, we had temperatures of 115, 120, but we also had some thunderstorms and rain, and things started to green up, which is, to see the desert turn green is just a phenomenal experience.
There were some people curious if oryx are poached as well.
I think for game meat they can be, but not so much, and there's not really like a really heavy demand from these poaching units. It would be more maybe for bush meat that people might be able to get away with. But their numbers, they're not nearly as critically threatened as the elephants, lions, and the rhinos.
There were some people who were curious about whether, since COVID, there have been changes in laws in China regarding illegal wildlife trade for these markets.
Yes, they have. And I do talk more about that in the webinar, but yes, that is one good thing about the COVID problem is that China has stopped that wildlife trade, thinking that it is the consumption of this wildlife that brought the virus. So though many of those markets are shut down, and now it's just illegal to trade any kind of wildlife. So you still may have some problems. And of course, like I said, China actually, when they do set laws like that down, things get done in China. But other countries that have the same kind of traditional Asian medicines, such as Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Korea, they don't necessarily have the government as efficient and strong as China. So Thailand, those kind of, actually worse than China. The poaching's just totally out of control. But yes, the answer to your question is yeah, they have become much more strict on the Chinese wildlife trade in the markets.
Okay, great. I think we'll call it there. And so I'd like to turn it back over to you, Brad, for some closing comments.
Okay, thank you guys for listening. I think we had pretty good turnout today. I'll go outside and enjoy the day if it's not too hot where you live. And yeah, I guess just kind of the main things are, in Africa needs lots of attention now. And one great way to do it is to go down there when we can. And hopefully the people that are really relying on their livelihood through tourism are going to make it through this giant mess. But there's also some other really cool agencies that are doing a lot of work there. And Kenya and Okavango Delta, they always get so much of Africa's attention. But I just like, and Namibia is kind of like the best kept secret, I think, in Africa. And so I just really, I always like to support the underdog. And so that's why it is really cool just to see what's in Namibia. Most people never even heard of it. They don't know that gorgeous scenery and all these special animals that are so tough and can survive in one of the driest places in the world. So I guess that's pretty much it.
Well, thank you so much, Brad. This was great. And my thanks as well to everyone who watched today. And be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose. We did record today's presentation, so we'll get that replay out to you soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, guys.